Dr. Marcus Hayes always knew there was something off about Blackwood Asylum. Built in the late 1800s, the sprawling Gothic structure loomed over the countryside, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the moonlit sky. Marcus had taken the night shift reluctantly, the extra pay being his only motivation. He'd heard the rumors, whispers of patients disappearing, staff driven to madness, and the unexplainable phenomena that plagued the halls. It was a stormy night when Marcus found himself alone in his office, the rain pelting the windows with a relentless fury. The power had flickered multiple times, casting the dimly lit room into brief periods of darkness. He sighed, rubbing his temples, the tension of the past few weeks weighing heavily on him. The patients had been more restless than usual, their screams echoing through the halls with an unsettling frequency. As he reviewed patient files, a loud crash reverberated through the asylum. Marcus jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the corridor, the beam cutting through the darkness. The asylum was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. He made his way to the source of the noise, the old kitchen. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a chaotic scene. Pots and pans were scattered across the floor, and the large industrial refrigerator stood ajar, its contents spilled out. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed the freezer door wide open. He knew it was always kept locked. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the distant wail of a patient. He stepped further into the room, his flashlight sweeping over the mess. A sudden movement caught his eye, and he turned quickly, but saw nothing. He was about to leave when he noticed a trail of wet footprints leading out of the kitchen. They were small, like those of a child, but there were no children in Blackwood Asylum. His curiosity piqued. Marcus followed the footprints down the hall, his nerves on edge. The trail led to the basement, a place he rarely ventured. The basement door groaned as he opened it, the air inside cold and damp. The flashlight flickered as he descended the stairs, casting long shadows on the walls. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and he could hear the faint drip of water echoing through the space. As he reached the bottom, he saw the footprints veer off into a narrow corridor lined with old, unused cells. The doors were rusted, their bars thick with grime. He shone his light into the first cell and recoiled in horror. Scrawled on the walls in what looked like blood were words and symbols, their meanings unclear but undeniably sinister. He moved from cell to cell, each one more disturbing than the last. Whispers filled the air, unintelligible and haunting. He felt a presence behind him and turned quickly, but saw only darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed on, compelled by a force he couldn't understand. At the end of the corridor, he found a cell door slightly ajar. The trail of footprints ended here. He hesitated before pushing the door open, his flashlight revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. The cell was larger than the others, its walls covered in the same disturbing symbols. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, upon which lay a small, childlike figure, shrouded in a tattered blanket. Marcus approached slowly, his heart racing. As he drew closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He reached out and pulled back the blanket, revealing a porcelain doll with a cracked face and lifeless eyes. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Suddenly, the doll's eyes snapped open, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. Marcus stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering bulb in the corridor. He scrambled to his feet, panic overtaking him, but the cell door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. They spoke of dark rituals, of sacrifices made to appease ancient, malevolent entities. The symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light, casting the room in a sickly greenish hue. Marcus felt a presence closing in on him, cold and oppressive. He backed into a corner, his mind racing. The doll's eyes followed him, its mouth twisted into a sinister smile. The whispers grew louder, drilling into his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. He could feel his sanity slipping away, the oppressive darkness swallowing him whole. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Marcus lunged at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers reached a crescendo, and he felt cold hands gripping him, pulling him back into the cell. His screams echoed through the asylum, unheard by the world outside. When the morning staff arrived, they found Marcus's office empty, his belongings untouched. A search of the asylum revealed no trace of him. The only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading to the basement, where they found the door ajar and the symbols on the walls. No one dared enter the cell. To this day, the staff at Blackwood Asylum speak in hushed tones about the disappearance of Dr. Marcus Hayes. They say that on stormy nights, you can still hear his screams echoing through the halls, a chilling reminder of the darkness that dwells within the asylum's walls. The carnival had rolled into town with its usual fanfare, bright lights, laughter, and the smell of cotton candy and fried food permeating the air. By day, it was a place of joy and excitement, but by night, a sinister air seemed to take over. The shadows grew longer, and the cheerful music took on a discordant, eerie tone. Lisa had taken a temporary job at the carnival, desperate for extra money. She had been assigned the night shift, overseeing the funhouse. It was an old, creaking structure filled with mirrors, optical illusions, and winding hallways designed to disorient and thrill visitors. During the day, the funhouse was a popular attraction, but at night, it was a place of foreboding. Her shift started at 10 p.m. As she walked towards the funhouse, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The carnival grounds were deserted, the silence broken only by the distant creak of the Ferris wheel and the occasional hoot of an owl. She reached the funhouse and unlocked the door, the hinges squealing in protest. The interior was dimly lit, the mirrors casting distorted reflections that made her uneasy. She turned on the main lights, but they flickered and buzzed, barely illuminating the maze of mirrors and dark corridors. Taking a deep breath, she settled into her station near the entrance, keeping an eye on the surveillance monitors. Hours passed slowly, the silence weighing heavily on her. She tried to distract herself by reading a book, but the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to concentrate. Around midnight, the monitors flickered, and the cameras picked up movement inside the funhouse. Her heart skipped a beat. She was sure she had locked the entrance behind her. She scanned the screens, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. In one of the mirrors, she saw a figure standing still, just out of view. It looked like a man, but his features were obscured by shadows. Lisa's pulse quickened. She grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The funhouse was a labyrinth of mirrors and hidden corners, each turn disorienting her further. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, her flashlight casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. She called out, but her voice echoed back at her, unanswered. As she rounded a corner, she caught a glimpse of the figure again, this time closer. He was tall and gaunt, his face a pale blur in the dim light. She felt a chill run down her spine. "Hello! Who's there?" she called, but the figure vanished around another corner. She pursued him, her footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors. The mirrors reflected her anxiety, twisted and distorted versions of herself staring back at her. She reached a dead end, a large mirror blocking her path. In the reflection, the figure stood behind her, impossibly close. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. Panic set in, and she started to retrace her steps, but the maze seemed to change around her. Paths that were once familiar now led to nowhere, and the mirrors seemed to mock her with their distorted images. Her flashlight began to flicker, and the cold intensified. She heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from all directions. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, pressing down on her chest. She tried to stay calm, but her fear was palpable. Suddenly, the mirrors began to crack, spiderweb patterns spreading across the glass. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She felt something brush against her skin, cold and clammy. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Desperate to escape, she ran through the maze, her flashlight barely illuminating the way. She stumbled upon a door she didn't remember seeing before. It was old and wooden, with strange symbols carved into its surface. She hesitated, but the whispers were closing in, driving her forward. She pushed the door open and stepped into a small room. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center and a mirror on the far wall. The mirror was different from the others, Its surface was dark and cloudy, as if hiding something. She approached it cautiously, her reflection barely visible in the murky glass. As she stood before the mirror, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see the gaunt figure standing in the doorway. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He stepped towards her, and she backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back at the mirror and to her horror saw her own reflection reaching out towards her. The glass rippled like water, and her reflection grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the mirror. She struggled, but the grip was unyielding, dragging her into the cold darkness. The last thing she saw was the gaunt figure's grin widening as he watched her vanish into the mirror. The door slammed shut, and the whispers resumed, more frenzied than ever. The next morning, the carnival workers found the funhouse locked and empty. Lisa's belongings were still at her station, but there was no sign of her. The mirrors in the funhouse were cracked, their surfaces stained with what looked like handprints. The workers spoke in hushed tones about the girl who had disappeared, and the funhouse gained a new reputation, a place haunted by the lost soul of Lisa, trapped forever in the mirror's dark embrace. To this day, visitors to the carnival are warned not to enter the funhouse after dark. They say that if you listen closely, you can still hear her whispers, calling out from the depths of the mirrors, forever seeking escape from her eternal prison. It was another late night at Harper & Associates, and Sarah was the only one left in the office. The clock on her desk showed 11:30 p.m., and the silence was only broken by the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. Sarah had been working late all week, trying to finish a project before the impending deadline. The office, usually bustling with activity, was now a maze of dark cubicles and eerie shadows cast by the dim overhead lights. Sarah sighed and stretched, her muscles aching from sitting too long. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the fatigue setting in, but she knew she had to push through. She saved her work and stood up to get a cup of coffee. As she walked to the break room, she noticed how different the office felt at night. The once familiar space now seemed alien and unsettling. She filled her mug and took a sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly she turned her head, but the break room was empty. She shook her head, chiding herself for being jumpy. It was just her imagination. Returning to her desk, she tried to focus on her work, but the feeling of unease persisted. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a brief shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Sarah glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. She continued working, but the strange occurrences became more frequent. The printer in the corner of the room suddenly whirred to life, spitting out blank pages. Her computer screen flickered, displaying distorted images for a split second before returning to normal. Each incident chipped away at her composure, increasing her anxiety. Desperate for a break, she decided to take a walk around the office. As she wandered the empty corridors, she heard faint whispers. She couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unsettling, like a conversation held just out of earshot. She followed the sound, her curiosity and fear battling within her. The whispers led her to the storage room at the far end of the office. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated before pushing it open. The room was filled with old files, dusty shelves, and unused office equipment. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but there was no one there. Sarah stepped inside, the door creaking as it swung shut behind her. She felt a chill in the air, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. She turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she tried to force it open, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Her flashlight app provided a narrow beam of light, barely illuminating the room. She scanned the shelves and noticed an old, dusty mirror in the corner. The glass was cloudy, obscuring her reflection. As she approached it, the temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the cold air. She stared into the mirror, trying to see her reflection, but the glass remained stubbornly opaque. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The mirror began to clear, and Sarah saw not her own reflection, but a dark figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. The door to the storage room finally creaked open, and she didn't hesitate to leave, practically running back to her desk. She grabbed her things, ready to leave the office for the night, but as she approached the exit, the lights went out. The office was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. Her phone's flashlight seemed pitifully weak against the enveloping blackness. The whispers were louder now, surrounding her, coming from all directions. She felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy. She yelped, turning her flashlight towards the sensation, but saw nothing. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she hurried towards the exit. She reached the front door, but it too was locked, the keycard access unresponsive. Panic gripped her as she pounded on the door, hoping someone outside might hear her. The whispers grew deafening, and she felt a presence closing in on her, suffocating her with its unseen force. In a desperate attempt to escape, she ran towards the emergency stairwell, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. She was trapped, the whispers now replaced by a low, menacing hum. She felt her sanity slipping away, the oppressive atmosphere crushing her spirit. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the office seemed normal again. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive presence lifted. Sarah stood there, trembling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She cautiously made her way back to her desk, her mind racing. As she approached her cubicle, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On her computer screen was a message typed in large, bold letters. "You can never leave." She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The oppressive presence was back, stronger this time. She felt something cold and heavy wrap around her, pulling her towards the storage room. She struggled, but it was futile. The invisible force dragged her through the office, the whispers mocking her, filling her mind with terror. She was pulled into the storage room, the door slamming shut behind her. The mirror in the corner glowed with an eerie light, and the dark figure reappeared, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Sarah's screams echoed through the empty office, unheard by the outside world. The next morning, her colleagues found her desk empty, her belongings undisturbed. A thorough search of the building revealed no trace of her. The only clue was the old mirror in the storage room, now shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor. To this day, the employees of Harper & Associates speak in hushed tones about the disappearance of Sarah. They say that on quiet nights you can still hear her screams and the whispers that drove her to madness. No one dares to stay late at the office anymore, fearing the same fate that befell her, forever trapped in the darkness, never to leave. It was past midnight when Dr. Emily Carter found herself alone in the dimly lit corridors of St. Augustine's Hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The hospital, usually bustling with activity, was now eerily quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional distant beep of a monitor. Emily had been working late for the past week, trying to catch up on paperwork and patient files. Her colleagues had left hours ago, leaving her to the solitude of the night shift. She preferred the quiet, or so she thought. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air, a palpable tension that made her skin prickle. She sat in her office, buried in charts, when she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. She looked up, scanning the room, but saw nothing. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as her imagination. Fatigue was playing tricks on her mind. Returning to her work, she tried to focus, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Emily stood up, curiosity and unease battling within her. She stepped into the corridor, the soft soles of her shoes making no sound on the cold linoleum floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the empty hallway. There was no response, only the whispering, which now seemed to surround her. It was unintelligible, like 100 voices speaking at once, just below the threshold of comprehension. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, leading her deeper into the hospital's older, unused wing. This part of the building had been abandoned for years, ever since the new wing had been built. It was scheduled for demolition, but for now it stood as a ghostly reminder of the past. The whispering grew louder as she approached a set of double doors marked morgue. Emily hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back, but something compelled her to push the doors open. The morgue was cold and dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. In the center of the room was a gurney, and on it lay a body covered with a white sheet. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been informed of any recent deaths. The whispering was now almost deafening, a cacophony of voices urging her forward. Against her better judgment, she approached the gurney. With trembling hands, she reached out and pulled back the sheet. Her scream echoed through the empty halls as she stumbled back, horror-stricken. The body on the gurney was her own. She stared in disbelief, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. The lifeless eyes staring back at her were unmistakably hers. Panic surged through her as the whispering intensified, the voices now clear and distinct. "Join us," they chanted. "Join us, Emily." The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emily felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and she whirled around, but there was no one there. She was alone, but the whispers continued, surrounding her, suffocating her. She ran from the morgue, her footsteps echoing in the deserted halls. But no matter how fast she ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. She burst into the stairwell, hoping to find refuge in the upper floors, but the whispers were everywhere. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They reached out to her, their cold fingers brushing her skin. Emily screamed, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to escape. The shadows closed in, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw was her own face, twisted in a grotesque grin as the shadows consumed her. The next morning, the staff found Dr. Emily Carter's office empty, her belongings untouched. A search of the hospital yielded no trace of her. The only clue was a faint whispering that could sometimes be heard in the hallways, a haunting reminder of the night she vanished. To this day, the staff at St. Augustine's Hospital speak in hushed tones about the ghost of Dr. Emily Carter, who wanders the halls, forever trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Her whispers a chilling warning to those who dare to work late at the hospital.